There are moments in military history when a single engagement redefines the assumptions of an entire era of strategic competition, when the weapon systems, doctrines, and force structures that nations have spent decades building are subjected to the unforgiving test of actual combat and found catastrophically inadequate against an adversary that prepared for the confrontation more carefully, more intelligently, and more honestly than those with more resources and more institutional confidence. Having spent years analyzing military operations and the intelligence assessments that precede and follow them, I have learned to distinguish between engagements that confirm existing doctrine and engagements that shatter it. What happened in the waters of the Taiwan Strait in a 22-minute window that will be studied in every serious military academy on the planet for the next century is firmly in the second category. Three People's Liberation Army Navy aircraft carriers, the Liaoning, the Shandong, and the Fujian, the centerpiece of Beijing's decade-long program to project naval power across the Western Pacific and to signal to Taiwan, Japan, the United States, and every other actor in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese military power had reached a qualitative threshold that made resistance to Chinese strategic objectives not just costly, but futile. Were destroyed in a strike sequence of such precision, speed, and technical sophistication that the analysts who have reviewed the engagement data are still working through the implications. I take no pleasure in describing what occurred. The human cost of this engagement, the sailors aboard those vessels, the aviators lost with their aircraft, the thousands of military personnel who entered the strait as part of what Beijing had publicly designated a routine naval exercise, represents a tragedy of enormous proportions, regardless of the political and strategic context that produced it. But the strategic implications are what they are. And the task of honest analysis requires confronting them directly, rather than retreating into the kind of diplomatic language that obscures rather than illuminates what has fundamentally changed. The weapon system that Taiwan employed in this engagement was the Xiongfeng 3 Extended Range, designated HF-3ER internally within the Republic of China military, a supersonic anti-ship missile developed by the National Chung-Shan Institute of Science and Technology in Longtan, Taoyuan County, that represents the culmination of a 20-year indigenous weapons development program funded through annual defense budgets that Taiwan's critics in Washington and Beijing had repeatedly characterized as insufficient to produce genuine peer capability against People's Liberation Army systems. Those critics were wrong, and the 22-minute engagement is the proof. The HF-3ER accelerates to Mach 2.5 in its terminal phase through a ramjet propulsion system that ingests atmospheric oxygen rather than carrying onboard oxidizer, providing specific impulse advantages that translate to greater terminal velocity and maneuverability than the rocket-propelled systems it was developed to defeat. The weapon's navigation architecture integrates inertial guidance for the cruise phase, GPS/GLONASS dual constellation positioning for mid-course correction against a maneuvering target, and a dual-mode terminal seeker combining active radar and passive anti-radiation homing in a configuration that can exploit the carrier's own radar emissions to refine the terminal guidance solution in the final 12 seconds of flight. Against an aircraft carrier operating its air search radar, fighter direction radar, and fire control systems simultaneously, as any carrier under air defense alert must do, the HF-3ER becomes actively more accurate as the defending carrier's crew attempts to track and engage it. Stay with me because the engagement sequence itself reveals a level of tactical sophistication in Taiwan's military planning that the People's Liberation Army simply did not credit as possible. And that failure of intelligence assessment is as consequential as the physical losses sustained. The tactical execution of the strike involved 3 coordinated salvos launched from different platform types across a geographic spread of nearly 400 kilometers, time to achieve simultaneous time on target against all 3 carriers within a window of approximately 90 seconds. The first salvo originated from a battery of land-based HF-3ER launchers positioned in reinforced tunnels in the central mountain range of Taiwan at altitudes above 3,000 meters above mean sea level, providing both concealment from Chinese surveillance and a ballistic advantage in the initial boost phase that extended the weapon's effective range by approximately 40 kilometers beyond its rated envelope from sea level launch. The second salvo originated from Taiwan's fleet of 12 Tuo Chiang-class corvettes, the catamaran-hulled fast attack craft that Taiwan has been producing at the Lungtae shipbuilding facility in Suao at a rate that Western naval observers had assessed as surprisingly high for a vessel of that capability class, a production rate that was, as we now understand, deliberately accelerated in preparation for exactly this kind of saturation strike requirement. The third salvo originated from a modified version of the indigenous defense fighter, equipped with an external centerline-mounted HF-3ER round in a new configuration that Taiwan's Aerospace Defense Command had held in classified readiness without disclosing its existence to foreign liaison partners, including American defense officials who had assessed the IDF's anti-ship capability as limited to the shorter-range Xiongfeng 2 variant. The People's Liberation Army Navy carrier battle groups entering the strait that morning were operating under a command framework that had been developed for a different threat environment, one in which Taiwan's anti-ship missile inventory was assessed as insufficient in both range and quantity to threaten multiple carrier groups simultaneously, in which the People's Liberation Army Navy's Type 055 large destroyer escorts would provide sufficient point defense layering to intercept the majority of any saturation strike Taiwan could generate, and in which the primary threat requiring management was the possible arrival of United States Navy forces from the east, rather than the demonstrated capability of Taiwan's indigenous systems from the west. That assessment, generated by the PLA's intelligence apparatus and validated by the academy and think tank networks that shape Chinese strategic planning, was comprehensively wrong on all three counts, and the 22-minute engagement exposed each of those errors simultaneously. What actually happened behind closed doors in Beijing in the hours following the engagement confirms the intelligence picture of a leadership that had constructed its strategic calculus on assessment it should have questioned more rigorously before committing its three most politically and symbolically significant naval assets to a strait crossing that its intelligence services had declared manageable. Xi Jinping was briefed on the engagement results in stages, with initial reports characterizing the losses as significant but containable, middle-tier reports revising the casualty and equipment assessments progressively upward as the full scope of what had occurred became clear, and a final briefing delivered by the chief of the Joint Staff Department approximately 6 hours after the last carrier slipped beneath the surface that used language no Chinese leader had heard applied to a military operation since the catastrophic losses of the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. The word that appears repeatedly in the internal records of that briefing, as reconstructed by multiple intelligence sources, is a Chinese term that translates most directly as unanticipated, a bureaucratic euphemism that in the context of a catastrophic military defeat means something closer to our intelligence community completely failed us, and we have no adequate framework for understanding what just happened. What I have not yet told you is that the 22 minutes of the engagement were not the beginning of this operation, but the culmination of a preparation timeline that extended back more than 18 months, during which Taiwan's military command conducted a systematic, classified operational planning process that exploited every asymmetric advantage available to a smaller power defending against a larger one that must project force across a contested maritime environment. The preparation included an extensive electronic intelligence collection campaign against the PLA Navy's carrier battle group communication architectures, conducted by Taiwan's Military Intelligence Bureau in coordination with American signals intelligence collection platforms. It provided detailed characterization of the command and communication protocols governing carrier battle group coordination during strait transit operations. The characterization identified specific intervals in the carrier battle group's communication cycles during which the Type 055 destroyer escort shifted between their area air defense radar modes and their local area surveillance modes. Intervals of between 8 and 14 seconds during which the point defense engagement radars were not actively searching the low-altitude threat azimuth from which the HF-3ER salvos were designed to approach. The strike timing was synchronized to those intervals with a precision that required coordinating launch timing across platforms separated by hundreds of kilometers, a coordination challenge that Taiwan's Joint Command solved through a classified timing protocol that American liaison officers were not informed about until after the engagement. The simultaneous time on target was not luck. It was the product of extraordinarily careful operational planning executed by a military that had studied the problem for years and had built its entire tactical architecture around exploiting a specific vulnerability it had identified and mapped with intelligence collection that the PLA Navy's own operational security failed to detect or counter. The consequence cascade from this engagement reshapes the strategic landscape of the Indo-Pacific in ways that will take years to fully absorb. At the immediate military level, the People's Liberation Army Navy has lost the core of its carrier aviation capability. All three of its operational carriers, along with the air wings embarked representing an estimated 96 J-15 and J-35 carrier-based fighters, 24 Z-18 and Z-9 helicopters, and approximately 4,400 naval personnel across the three vessels and their air wings. The replacement timeline for this capability, given Chinese shipyard capacity and the complexity of carrier aviation program development, is assessed at between 8 and 12 years for a single carrier replacement, meaning that the PLA Navy's expeditionary power projection capability has been effectively removed from the strategic equation for a decade or more. That timeline has immediate implications for every scenario in which Chinese carrier aviation was an assumed component of Beijing's military options. At the level of regional strategic competition, the engagement has fundamentally altered the credibility assessments of every actor in the Indo-Pacific who has been calibrating their security posture against the threat of Chinese military power projection. Japan's defense establishment, which has been debating the scope and pace of its own military modernization in the context of the Chinese carrier threat, will draw immediate conclusions about the relative importance of its own anti-ship missile programs versus other capability investments. The Republic of Korea will recalculate its own strategic exposure. The members of ASEAN who have been managing their relationships with Beijing, partly on the basis of assessments of Chinese military capability, will need to update those assessments substantially. And the United States Navy, which has been developing its own operational concepts for operating in the Western Pacific under the assumption that Chinese carrier aviation would eventually constitute a serious threat to American surface groups, will need to integrate the lessons of this engagement into its own force development planning. At the level of Chinese domestic politics, the consequences are the most uncertain and potentially the most dangerous. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy bargain with the Chinese population has incorporated a narrative of steadily increasing military capability and strategic respect that has been central to the party's identity under Xi Jinping. The destruction of 3 aircraft carriers, vessels that were presented to the Chinese public as symbols of China's arrival as a genuine great power with blue water naval reach. In a 22-minute engagement conducted by an island the party officially characterizes as a renegade province that lacks even the international standing of a recognized state, is the kind of event that cannot be managed by information control alone. In the era of globally distributed social media and satellite imagery accessible to ordinary citizens with smartphones. The political pressure that this defeat generates inside China is not something that analytical models developed during the period of continuous Chinese military success are well calibrated to assess. What I can tell you, based on historical patterns of how authoritarian systems respond to unexpected military humiliation, is that the range of possible responses includes both accelerated escalation, as the leadership attempts to restore the credibility narrative through additional military action, and internal political instability as factions within the party and the military establishment assign accountability for a catastrophic intelligence and operational failure. Neither of those possible trajectories leads to a more stable regional environment in the near term. I have been watching military competitions between states for most of my adult life, and the lesson I keep relearning is that the states that win the crucial engagements are rarely the ones with the largest defense budgets or the most impressive platforms. They are the ones that have understood their adversaries' vulnerabilities most clearly, prepared most honestly for the specific combat conditions they would face, and maintained the operational security discipline to deny their adversary the knowledge that would allow course correction before the engagement occurred. Taiwan did all three of those things over a period of years, while the People's Liberation Army Navy was focused on demonstrating its growing capabilities through exercises, port visits, and strait crossings designed to communicate power rather than develop the intelligence awareness needed to understand the threat they were actually facing. 22 minutes. 3 carriers. The assumptions of a decade of Chinese naval investment tested against an adversary that prepared more carefully for the confrontation than anyone in Beijing had been willing to honestly acknowledge, and found catastrophically inadequate. This is what happens when strategic overconfidence meets genuinely prepared defense. The intelligence failure at the heart of this disaster deserves a sustained examination because it represents a systemic breakdown across every layer of the People's Liberation Army's intelligence and assessment architecture rather than a single-point failure that can be corrected through personnel changes or organizational reforms. The foundation of the intelligence failure was an assumption error that became embedded in Chinese strategic planning at the highest levels and was never subjected to the rigorous adversarial challenge that would have revealed its inadequacy. The assumption was straightforward and seemingly reasonable. Taiwan's indigenous defense industry, constrained by a population of 23 million, an economy that, while robust, is dwarfed by the mainland's, and a political environment in which defense spending has historically faced domestic competition from social investment priorities, could not produce weapons systems capable of threatening the PLA Navy's most capable platforms in a simultaneous multi-axis engagement. That assumption was not derived from poor intelligence collection on specific programs. It was derived from a structural assessment of Taiwan's capacity that overlooked a fundamental principle of asymmetric military competition, that a defending power with geographic advantages, detailed knowledge of the adversary's operational patterns, and decades of preparation time can optimize its limited resources to exploit specific vulnerabilities in a larger adversary's force structure in ways that produce combat outcomes dramatically disproportionate to the raw capability balance. Taiwan did not need to match China's overall naval power. It needed to develop sufficient capability to destroy the specific platforms that Chinese strategic culture had identified as the symbols and instruments of Chinese power projection. The carriers were the target set. The HF-3ER program was the solution. The intelligence apparatus that should have identified this logic and the program that expressed it failed at every organizational level, from field collection through finished intelligence production and senior leadership briefing. The operational security discipline that Taiwan maintained throughout the extended preparation period for this engagement reflects a degree of counterintelligence sophistication that will reshape how every military power in the world thinks about protecting sensitive weapons programs from adversary intelligence collection. The National Chung-Shan Institute of Science and Technology implemented a compartmentalization architecture for the HF-3ER Extended Range Program that separated the Propulsion Development Team, the Navigation System Development Team, the Seeker Development Team, and the Integration and Testing Team into cells with no direct communication channels and no shared documentation repositories accessible to any individual outside a small program management office. Personnel assigned to each cell were told they were working on a component for a land attack cruise missile system, which was technically true of the underlying engineering but obscured the weapon's primary anti-ship design optimization. The production facility for the weapon's critical components was integrated into a larger commercial aerospace manufacturing complex in central Taiwan, with the relevant production lines accessible only through separate entrances with independent security protocols and no visual or logistical connection to the commercial operations conducted in the adjacent facility spaces. The testing program for the full weapon system was conducted at sea in weather conditions selected specifically to degrade overhead satellite collection by both Chinese and, as a deliberate security measure, American reconnaissance platforms, with launch events timed to the orbital windows of known collection satellites and coordinated with Taiwan's meteorological service to exploit cloud cover that provided optical obscuration while maintaining the flight conditions required for valid performance data collection. This was not ad hoc operational security improvised under the pressure of an impending conflict. It was a systematic, years-long program of counterintelligence discipline executed by an institution that had studied the methods by which previous Taiwanese military programs had been compromised by Chinese intelligence penetration and had built this program specifically to deny those methods any opportunity for success. The implications for American defense planning and American intelligence assessments of Allied capabilities are significant and require honest acknowledgement. American defense officials who were unaware of the HF-3ER Extended Range Program, who were not informed about the modified IDF anti-ship configuration, and who were not brought into the operational planning process for the engagement were operating with an incomplete picture of Taiwanese military capability that shaped American contingency planning in ways that will now require fundamental revision. The assumption embedded in American military planning that Taiwan could delay a PLA invasion for a limited period while American forces arrived to reinforce the defense, the so-called porcupine strategy debate that has dominated American security policy circles for years. An assessment of Taiwanese military capability that was missing the most consequential element of Taiwan's actual defensive arsenal. American planners were assessing Taiwan's ability to resist invasion without knowing that Taiwan had developed the ability to destroy the carrier aviation capability that Chinese operational plans designated as the primary instrument of air superiority establishment over the strait during an invasion operation. That planning gap has now been revealed, and the revision of American contingency planning for Taiwan scenarios will need to begin from a substantially different understanding of what Taiwan's military is actually capable of and how Taiwanese military planning has been developing in the classified spaces that American liaison relationships have not penetrated. The question of what happens in the aftermath of this engagement in the immediate operational sense is one that analysts are working through with genuine uncertainty because the engagement has introduced variables into the regional security environment that no existing model was designed to handle simultaneously. The PLA's remaining naval assets in the theater, the surface action groups built around Type 055 and Type 052, D-guided missile destroyers, the submarine force composed of Type 093 and Type 094 nuclear-powered submarines, and the Type 039 conventional submarine fleet, and the land-based air assets of the Eastern Theater Command Air Force. retain significant military capability that Taiwan's defense establishment must now factor into its operational planning under conditions of both tactical success and strategic uncertainty. The PLA leadership faces the choice between standing down and absorbing an unprecedented public military humiliation, or escalating with remaining assets in a context where the intelligence and operational assumptions that governed the original operation have been comprehensively invalidated. Neither choice is strategically attractive, and the decision calculus in Beijing is being conducted under the compounding pressures of domestic political expectations, international scrutiny, and the military leadership's own need to demonstrate that the institution can adapt to what it has just experienced. I have watched military institutions make decisions under exactly this combination of pressures before, and the outcomes have ranged from wise strategic restraint to catastrophic escalation, with the determining variable being the quality of the leadership's ability to distinguish between what is strategically necessary and what is politically convenient. The next 72 hours will reveal which type of leadership is making decisions in Beijing. The Taiwan Strait will not return to the status quo that defined it before this engagement. What comes next, whether escalation, negotiation, or a prolonged strategic recalibration in Beijing, will be shaped by the choices made in the next several weeks by leaders on all sides who are navigating strategic terrain for which their existing maps are now dangerously outdated.